For more than half of the 20th century, Eastern Europe was gripped in the iron fist of communism. Imprisonment without trial, torture and political assassinations became commonplace, as brutal dictators used every means necessary to maintain their stranglehold on power. Under totalitarian rule, the state reached into every corner of life. In the communist heartland of the Soviet Union and its satellites across Eastern Europe, all aspects of culture became politicized, including the continent's most popular pastime, football. But right from the start, communist hardliners considered football bourgeois and anti-revolutionary, and many wanted to see it abolished. But it would prove much harder than they ever imagined to gain full control of the people's game. In the years after Lenin led the communists to victory in the Russian Revolution, his Bolshevik party took control of all aspects of culture. Yet despite their reservations about the bourgeois nature of football, even hardcore communists were wary about denying the people their chance to enjoy the beautiful game.
В советские времена, футбол был главное зрелище. Оно заменяло все. Как у нас, заменяли религию, футбол и хоккей. Потому что жизнь была очень тяжелая. Многие сидели в тюрьме, половина народа. В деревне есть нечего. И был футбол, который всех соединял.
Instead of opposing football in the mid-1920s, the communist leaders sought to control it. After the revolution, Moscow had 4 main clubs, each of which was the footballing arm of a powerful Soviet institution, funded and run by an organ of the state. CDKA Moscow belonged to the fearsome Red Army. ZIL, the city's giant car plant, controlled Torpedo Moscow. Lokomotiv was owned by the Rail Ministry. And most notoriously of all, Dynamo Moscow was the creation of the dreaded secret police. The patronage of Dynamo Moscow by the secret police was most evident when the KGB was run by one of Stalin's henchmen, Lavrenti Beria. Beria was one of the most vicious and powerful men in the Soviet Union. He personally ordered the execution of many thousands he considered to be enemies of the people. As head of the KGB, Beria was also the honorary president of Dynamo Moscow. He'd been a keen amateur footballer and was a passionate supporter, and he was determined to use every means at his disposal to ensure Dynamo's supremacy. But soon Beria faced someone who was prepared to resist his attempt to control Russian football. Nikolai Starostin was the eldest of 4 brothers. A natural athlete, Starostin was captain of the Soviet Union at both football and ice hockey. Together with Kosarev, Starostin wanted to create a team to challenge the supremacy of Dynamo, a club for the people that would cater for white-collar workers and civilians. Starostin suggested a name inspired by Spartacus, the slave who rebelled against the power of Rome. Spartak Moscow was born.
Но Старостин придумали это романтическое. Спартак, гладиаторы, борцы за народ, за свободу. Это оппозиционный клуб, в первую очередь. Все знали, что да, Спартак – это наша команда. Офицеры, значит, полиции, офицеры армии. А эти не полиция, не армия, а, мол, обыкновенные граждане. Поэтому их, конечно, любили в собой.
Starostin and his 3 brothers, Alexander, Andrei and Pyotr, were the core of a side that proved it could match the best. They also established the club's reputation for defiant independence. To support Spartak became a small act of resistance against Beria, Stalin and Soviet tyranny.
There's no doubt that a lot of the Spartak supporters were actually genuine oppositionists who didn't dare perhaps show their opposition in other areas of life. The football stadium was really the only location where you could be yourself, where you could shout, smile, laugh, cry, where you could call the opposition, and that often meant the government, the party, police chief, all the names under the sun.
To Beria, any act of defiance was intolerable. Spartak's flagrant refusal to bow to Dinamo was a direct challenge to Beria's control of Soviet sport. Despite the dangers, the Starostin Spartak team refused to surrender. In 1939, Spartak was on the verge of an unprecedented league and cup double when they faced Beria's Dinamo side in the semi-finals. It was Dinamo versus Spartak, Beria versus Starostin. Spartak won, a victory in a time of brutal purges and unspeakable hardship. But Beria wouldn't let his beloved Dinamo be denied so easily. Incensed by the result, he ordered the game to be replayed a whole month later. But Spartak and the Starostins failed to take the hint and won again, 1-0. To antagonize Beria even further, Spartak went on to win the cup.
It was unfortunate because Lavrenti Beria was the honorary president of Dynamo, but he went to every home game and was absolutely incensed when Spartak took over the crown from Dinamo. Starostin. He looked up to the dignitaries' box and saw Beria in absolute fury, kicking chairs all over the place before he stormed out.
Even though they'd made an enemy of one of the Soviet Union's most powerful and ruthless men, the Starostins were seemingly untouchable.
The power of football was such that it was beyond the grasp of Joseph Stalin and his henchman, Lavrenti Beria. You could arrest any poet you liked, you could arrest any artist, musician, any composer, but you couldn't with impunity arrest a footballer. And that was the power of football.
But Beria was simply biding his time. Eventually, the perfect opportunity did come. In March 1942, when the people of the Soviet Union were distracted by Nazi Germany's invasion and the entry of their country into the Second World War, Beria made his move. In the middle of the night, Nikolai Starostin was woken in classic KGB style, with a torch shining in his eyes and 2 pistols pointing at his head.
It's part of the megalomania of Beria. There's no doubt that in many ways he was unhinged. He was a sadistic paedophile, for example. And I guess Beria thought it's safe in terms that the population may have other things on their minds to arrest the Starostin brothers for the affront of beating Dynamo in 1939. But that certainly is what Nikolai Starostin said to me. Football is so important. That's really the point, that it needs that sort of total revenge.
All 4 brothers were arrested and faced a litany of charges, from the obligatory one of making anti-Soviet statements to the more unusual accusation of playing football in a bourgeois way. Most alarmingly, these hugely popular players were branded with Beria's favorite label, enemies of the people.
He fulfilled his target just to take them out of Spartak, and they thought that without them, Spartak would ruin it. They were not terrorists, they were not politicians, they were just football players. Okay, very popular, very powerful, but football players. They were heroes.
The Starostins escaped the death penalty that Beria would usually serve upon his victims, but still they were sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian gulag. In the Russian state archives, researchers have uncovered a letter sent from Starostin's mother to Stalin, pleading clemency for her sons.
Дела у нас расположены здесь, в том числе и письмо гражданки Старостиной, направленное Иосифу Виссарионовичу Сталину с просьбой помиловать ее сыновей. Как вы видите, вместо Иосифа Сталина письмо было направлено товарищу Берия.
Beria had intercepted the plea for mercy. There would be no reprieve. But for Nikolai, at least, the time spent in the Gulag was far from typical of the experience of most inmates living in the harshest prison regime in the world.
Football helps him to survive in these Gulag camps because even criminals respect him.
Жизнь братьев Старостина для многих заключенных это была как жизнь, как сказка, когда они были на воле до ареста. И понятно, многие слушали с интересом их рассказы о поездках за границу, о встречах за границей, о футболе, о всей этой спортивной жизни. Среди руководства лагерей, администрации лагерей было немало любителей футбола.
Without Nikolai Starostin and his brothers, Spartak were a weakened force in Soviet football, clearing the way for the Red Army club CDKA Moscow to challenge Beria's Dinamo. But CDKA's days were also numbered. Many of their players starred in the Soviet team that played their Eastern Bloc allies Yugoslavia in the 1952 Helsinki Olympics. Under their dictator Marshal Joseph Tito, Yugoslavia had loosened its ties with the Soviet Union. So the match became a battle between Yugoslav nationalism and Soviet pride. For the players and the politicians, there was more at stake than just the result. When the Soviets lost 3-1, Stalin immediately ordered CDKA to be dismantled. Overnight, the side that had become the biggest rival to Beria's Dinamo had disappeared.
Ну, это была страшная глупость, потому что, они, во-первых, не виноваты. А если даже и виноваты, клуб же, в котором есть еще дубль, юношеские команды, футбольная школа, целая система, как команды вынуть из чемпионата, как у Манчестер Юнайтед вынуть из чемпионата, Арсенал, Челси. Политика и футбол.
In 1953, Stalin died. Beria's bid to succeed him failed, and when Nikita Khrushchev became leader, Beria's fate was sealed. Charged with being a capitalist spy, Beria was found guilty. He was condemned as an enemy of the people, the very same accusation he'd directed at thousands of innocent people throughout his long, brutal career. Beria was executed, allegedly on his knees as he begged for clemency. After his death, the charges against the Starostin brothers were declared illegal, and they were finally allowed back to Moscow. Their footballing days were over, but Nikolai took a leading role at Spartak, eventually becoming its president. He initiated a glorious new era, once again at the expense of the old enemy, Dinamo.
Starostin told me many times that his life was saved time and time again by football itself. He should have been arrested when Spartak did the Golden Double in 1939, and he puts it down to his popularity in football and the place of Spartak and that football played in Soviet society.
Club sides were representing powerful state institutions, and national sides were supposedly playing for the glory of communism. In 1952, Hungary became the Olympic football champions, having disposed of the Soviet Union's conquerors Yugoslavia 3-1 in the final. The Olympic title carried immense prestige, and its value wasn't lost on the man who was proud to call himself Stalin's best Hungarian disciple, the country's communist leader, Matyas Rákosi. Hungary's goalkeeper, Gyula Grosic, can still remember the political dimensions involved in playing for the team.
Hát általában azokban az években óriási politikai nyomás nehezedett a csapatra, főleg az akkori állami és politikai vezetés részéről. Elsősorban ugye Rákosi Mátyás volt az, aki különös gonddal és figyelemmel kísérte a magyar csapat szereplését.
By the end of 1952, the Hungarian team had gone 30 matches undefeated. They had earned a reputation for being one of the most exciting teams in the world. But they were about to face their greatest challenge. In more than 90 years of international matches, England had never been beaten at Wembley by foreign opposition. In November 1953, Hungary was invited to play a full-strength England to decide who was the best team in the world. György Sepesi was the Hungarian commentator for what was being described as the match of the century.
Angliában elkönyvelték, hogy ez egy olyan barátságos mérkőzés, amelyen Anglia sima győzelmet arat. Lehet, hogy ez az évszázad mérkőzése a sajtóban, lehet, hogy 100 000 néző, vagy közel 100 000 néző, tehát ház volt a Wembley stadionban, de biztos angol győzelemre számítottak.
But the English complacency was about to receive a rude awakening.
Now there's an exhibition of ball control. Just look at that from the inside left Puskás. Well, we see a great deal of that. I think we're going to have an awful lot of trouble holding these unbeaten Hungarians.
The star striker Hidegkuti scored within the first 45 seconds. Throughout, the Hungarians were imperious.
It's a goal!
By the end, Hungary had 35 shots to England's 5.
A lovely goal!
The myth of English footballing superiority had been cruelly exposed. Communist Hungary had given capitalist England a football lesson.
It's all over. England 3, Hungary 6.
And throughout, their leader Rákosi was watching.
Ez ugye, ha vesszük, akár politikailag is vehetjük, egy kommunizmus és kapitalizmus összecsapása, vehetjük azt, hogy két játékrendszernek az összecsapása, a másik pedig az, hogy az angolok ebben az új játékszisztémre nem készültek fel.
The Hungarian coach Gustav Sebeś was not only a high-ranking politician himself, he was undoubtedly a tactical genius who had developed a dynamic, artistic style of play that simply bewitched the rigid, formulaic, traditional English approach. Sebeș's was the world's first example of total football, the fluid interchange of positions on the pitch.
There is number 5, but he's not the centre half.
And in subsequent years would be adopted across the world, most notably in Brazil. But Hungary also boasted some truly great players, and one in particular, Ferenc Puskás, who even today is considered one of the greatest footballers ever. The victory over England had shifted the epicenter of world football eastwards, and the success would be seized upon by the country's new liberalizing Prime Minister, Imre Nagy. Nagy's reformist new course sought to reinstate some of the freedoms lost under Soviet rule.
A kormánynak pedig annyiban, hogy akkor már egy ilyen reformprogramon volt túl a Nagy Imre kormány, és nagyon jó hátteret adott ennek a programnak a megvalósításához, ez a 6-3-as győzelem.
A magyar csapat eredményei, játéka nagymértékben befolyásolta 10-valahány millió magyar hangulatát néhány 90 perc során, mert ehhez feltétlenül kapcsolódik Magyarországnak azokban az években a politikai, társadalmi, gazdasági, kulturális helyzete, az akasztófák árnyékában, a börtön, a kitelepítés, az internálás, a fenyegetettség állapotában. Akkor volt egy labdarúgó csapat, amely magával ragadta a közvéleményt, és néhány 90 percre elénekelhettük a himnuszt hangosan, egymás kezét fogva. Óriási jelentősége volt.
Hungary's Aranc Csapat, or Golden Team, were now overwhelming favourites to lift the 1954 World Cup in Switzerland. The players were left in little doubt what their communist leaders expected of them.
Hangosan ki nem mondott, de általunk nagyon is érzékelhető olyan követelmény támasztott a politikai vezetés a csapattal szemben, ami annyit jelentett, hogy csak a világbajnoki cím elnyerése az a teljesítmény, amelyet elfogadnak. Minden más elfogadhatatlan.
In the early stages, everything went as planned. In the group stages, they trounced West Germany 8-3. Then followed two tough encounters with Brazil and Uruguay. The Hungarians prevailed, but their games against the South Americans left them bruised and exhausted. It was a relief then that in the final they would meet West Germany, the same side they'd comprehensively demolished 8-3 earlier in the tournament. The scene was set, so it seemed, for the magnificent Magyars' greatest triumph.
Én magamról beszélek csak. Én úgy éreztem abban a pillanatban, hogy hála Isten csak a nyugatnémetek ellen játsszuk a döntőt.
Though clearly struggling from an earlier injury, Puskás had declared himself fit for the final and was instrumental in Hungary racing into an early lead.
És akkor a 8. percben elkönyveltem jó magam is, hogy ez a győzelem már biztosan a miénk. Én azt hittem, hogy a végeredmény 5-1 lesz.
But as the first half wore on, Germany edged back into the game. Hungary's hard earlier matches began to take their toll.
Akkor 2-2 lett ugye a félidő. Hát megmondom, a félidőben én legalábbis akkor éreztem először a válogatott pályafutásomban, hogy hát elveszítsük a mérkőzést, hogy nem fogjuk tudni megnyerni, mert hát ugye az a Uruguay mérkőzés sokat kivett belőlünk.
Though struggling with fatigue, Hungary used their superior technique to dominate much of the second half. Shot after shot rained down on the German goal, but in vain. With just 6 minutes to go, West Germany took the lead. But within minutes, Puskás seemed to have scored a last-gasp equaliser. But his goal was controversially disallowed by the English referee, Bill Ling.
Amely végképp befolyásolta a találkozó, hogy a Puskás néhány perccel a befejezés előtt rúgott egy teljesen szabályos gólt, amit a játékvezető először megadott, aztán visszavonta, és így maradt a német csapat 3-2-es győzelme.
Bevallom őszintén, hogy amikor a németek a harmadik góljukat elérték, elcsuklott a hangom, elsírtam magam, és még ma is kicsit könnyes a szemem, ha erre gondolok.
In West Germany, the victory became known as the Miracle of Bern, and to many, it helped the country rehabilitate itself as a sporting nation. For the great golden team, all they could do was to stand in the rain and listen while the national anthem of West Germany, not Hungary, was played in the stadium.
Én azt hiszem, hogy az embernek legszomorúbb pillanatai voltak, és hát én azt szoktam mondani, hogy apámat, akit előtte temettünk el jó pár évvel, azon nem sírtam a temetésén, itt bizony kijöttek a könnyeim.
But the repercussions of the defeat would stretch far beyond the football field. The success of the team was supposed to vindicate the regime. It would hide the oppression and distract the people. Instead, it had backfired spectacularly.
A döntő után Budapesten több százezer, talán milliós nagyságrendű tömeg vonult ki az utcákra, és tüntetett a vereség miatt. Majd ennek ürügyén néhány órával később az esti órákban már egyértelműen a rendszer ellen tüntetett.
The communist leader Rákosi was furious. On its way back to Budapest, the players' train was intercepted by the Hungarian State Security Police. The team was ordered off the train and told to attend a dinner that night, where Rákosi and the rest of Hungary's political hierarchy would be present.
Ez nem volt egy jó előjel. Na most ugye befejeztük a vacsorát, a Rákosi felállt, és néhány keresetlen mondatban biztos vagyok benne, mondta ő, és hát ennek a vereségnek, nyugodjanak meg az elvtársak, nem lesz következménye. És akkor néhányan a játékosok közül tudtuk, hogy ennek a vereségnek lesznek következményei. Mert a Rákosi azt mondja, hogy nem lesznek, akkor annak éppen az ellenkezője az igaz.
Grosic's fears would be proved right. Unfairly blamed for 2 of the German goals, Grosic bore the wrath of the communist hierarchy. On returning to Hungary, he was detained without reason and placed under house arrest.
Tábornoki kihallgatásra vezettek elő, ahol a honvédelmi miniszter azzal kezdte a meghallgatásomat, hogy közölte, a vád ellenem az államvédelmi hatóság, tehát az AVH részéről a vád ellenem kémkedés gyanúja, mely kimeríti a hazaárulás fogalmát. És ehhez hozzátette a honvédelmi miniszter, hogy vegyem tudomásul, hogy ezért más embert már ebben az országban felakasztottak volna.
The proceedings were eventually stopped due to a complete lack of evidence. Even so, Rákosi himself decreed that Grosic should be exiled to the football backwater of Tatabánya. But the consequences of the defeat would affect every Hungarian. It exposed the underlying dissatisfactions of life under communism, emotions that had been temporarily obscured by the blinding success of Hungary's football team.
Ilyen jelentősége volt azokban az években a labdarúgó válogatott szereplésének, győzelmeinek és a vereség után a végletek eluralkodásának Budapesten.
On October the 23rd, 1956, thousands of Hungarians took to the streets in a full-scale revolution against their Soviet occupiers.
Azt mondottam, és mondom ma is, hogy az 54-es vereség után Budapesten kialakult helyzet, tehát a több százezer ember utcára vonulása és tüntetése a rendszer ellen már valahol az 1956-os forradalomnak volt egy előjátéka.
The West looked on as the Soviet Union invaded and quickly re-established communist control, killing up to 50,000 Hungarians as they crushed the uprising. As Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, Hungary's golden team broke up for fear of reprisals, and Hungarian football has never scaled the same heights since. In their 6 years at the pinnacle of world football, Hungary lost only one game, but it was the one that mattered most. By the Soviet Union was condemned around the world. Its legacy tarnished the achievements of a country that just a few weeks later would top the medals table at the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, including winning the prestigious football tournament. But there was soon to be a harsh reminder that football in the Soviet Union was always more than just a game. Soviet football had produced another national superstar, as famous as Nikolai Starostin had been in his youth. Eduard Streltsov was the George Best of his day. He was a pin-up and a drinker, but his skill was without equal. On his debut for the USSR in 1955, the 17-year-old Streltsov scored a hat-trick in a 6-0 thrashing of Sweden. To this day in Russia, the backheel pass is still known as the Streltsov. The Soviets had amassed a superb team, led by one of the world's greatest ever goalkeepers, Lev Yashin. With Streltsov, they were capable of beating anybody.
В России было 2 гениальных футболиста. Великих футболистов было довольно много, но 2 гениальных футболиста. Это Лев Яшин, которого знает почти весь мир, и Эдуард Стрельцов, которого знают только дома. Но для российской публики Стрельцов и Яшин фигуры совершенно одного масштаба.
The stage was set for Streltsov to become one of the stars of the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. But just a few days before the team was due to leave for the World Cup, Streltsov was arrested on suspicion of the rape of a young woman at a party in Moscow. To this day, many people believe the charge was a malicious communist setup in revenge for Streltsov insulting the daughter of the culture minister, Ekaterina Futsieva, at the party. Futsieva was the only female member of the Politburo, and consequently the most powerful woman in the Soviet Union.
Справедливо только одна, что действительно на каком-то приеме в Кремле действительно Фурцева хотела познакомить его с дочерью, а он какую-то глупость сказал. Ну, он действительно был человек непосредственный, никогда не думал, что он говорит, и не был готов. Хотя он вообще-то был очень свободный для советского человека. Он себя абсолютно никак не сковывал. Вот это, честно говоря, и не очень нравилось начальству.
There were other reasons why Streltsov had created enemies in the highest echelons of Soviet power. He was due to represent the elite of Soviet sport at the World Cup, to be a clean-cut ambassador for communist ideology. But there was a problem. Streltsov's teddy boy haircut symbolized his rebellious streak and his love of the high life. Streltsov had become a symbol for a new type of relationship between communism and football.
Вызвало уже политический интерес. Впервые молодежь Советского Союза увидела другую жизнь и узнала, что есть другая жизнь. Нормальная жизнь. И вот надо было приструнить эту самую молодежь. Ну и этим замечательным политикам в Кремле 50-х годов показалось, что лучше, чем расправа над Стрельцовым.
Edward Maximovsky has set up a public committee working on the posthumous acquittal of Streltsov. A lawyer and football fan, Maximovsky has spent 10 years trawling through the court files of the Streltsov case.
Вот за этим окном находится самая угрюмая, самая древняя тюрьма России. Бутырский замок, Бутырка. Вот сюда, почти полвека назад, вот сюда, привезли раздавленного, перепуганного нашего великого футболиста Эдуарда Стрельцова. Первое. Ну, конечно, это дело, говоря языком юристов, незаконное и необоснованное. Второе. Да ну просто юридически смешное. Так вот, в этом самом протоколе судебного следствия 12 свидетелей, ну, все опрошенные, под всю эту клятву, 12 свидетелей заявили, что не видели, не знают, не присутствовали.
Undoubtedly, Streltsov also offended the powers that be by refusing to join either the army club, now reformed as CSKA, or the KGB club, Dinamo.
Но он никогда никуда не пойдет, вот он все намерен. Его уже звали в «Динамо». Яшину поручили позвать его в «Динамо». Если бы он пошел в «Динамо», ну, как-то «Динамо», один я не пойду, и вот он не пошел. Ни в армию, ни в «Динамо», и в 50-е годы он ни в какой тюрьме не сидел.
Whatever the reasons behind his arrest, Streltsov eventually confessed to the rape, but only after his KGB interrogators told him he could go to the World Cup if he admitted his crime.
Вот здесь, в Бутырской тюрьме, в 55-ю камеру, пришел следователь, позвал Стрельцова, сказал ему: «Ну, Эдик, не переживай. Ну, ты же великий футболист, ты известен всей стране, всему миру. Да кто же тебя сажать-то будет? Нам нужно быстренько это дело закрыть. И ты еще успеешь в Швецию».
But this was a ruse, and the young and naive Streltsov fell for it. As soon as he signed the confession, the KGB reneged on their promise. Instead, now that he was seen to be admitting his guilt, the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev himself decreed that Streltsov should be sent to serve hard labor in the Gulag. Without Streltsov, the Soviets performed badly at the World Cup. They lost to Sweden 2-0, the team that they'd easily beaten 6-0 with Streltsov in the side. many Russians believe the World Cup would have been the perfect theatre in which Streltsov would have shone.
Несомненно, мир бы узнал его в то же самое время. Почему у нас часто говорят, что это русский Пеле? Более широкого и ни на кого не похож.
Among Streltsov's staunchest supporters is the former world chess champion Anatoly Karpov. He's also an active member of the committee to clear Streltsov's name.
So people in Russia believe that he could become even more famous than Pelé because he had great talent, and he was the greatest Russian football player. And of course, people regretted and still regret that Streltsov couldn't show his best football abilities, and because of that case. At that time, legal system depended strongly from the political leaders, and in many cases, political leaders could just force legal system to make one decision or another.
After his release in 1963, Streltsov did make a comeback. He was still only 26, but he was noticeably slower and weaker. Even so, fans flocked to see him play for his old club, Torpedo Moscow. He was instrumental in their winning the league title in 1965.
I went to see him a few times. He'd lost a lot of speed, of course, but his talents were still there. Really, one of the greatest players I've ever seen.
Viktor Shustyakov was a friend and teammate of Streltsov. They played together in the Torpedo Stadium that now bears Streltsov's name.
Как сказать, он особо там не хвастался. Он особо так не хвастался, что вот я, Стрельцов, вот. Поэтому он никого, и даже, я скажу, и бранным словом ни на кого даже не ругался никогда, даже всегда как-то все дружно было. Поэтому его очень любили.
Today, Streltsov's son Igor still lives in the flat he once shared with his father near the Torpedo Stadium.
Сейчас об этом трудно все говорить-то. Это надо было не сажать человека, а дать ему поиграть. Может, он сколько еще побед бы принес этим 4 буквам СССР.
But Streltsov's international career was over. Even after his release, he wasn't allowed to travel abroad. Streltsov would never get the opportunity to demonstrate his talent on the world stage.
Streltsov would be remembered forever as a genius of football. I think with Streltsov case, they just ruined the history of all Soviet Union national team.
Despite the disastrous impact on his life and career, Streltsov would never speak of his lost time in the Gulag.
Встречаемся, после игры там встречаемся иногда. Вот. Разно бывает там, и день рождения у нас бывает, все вместе мы проводим, там и праздники все-таки. Вот. И он никогда не говорил на этих праздниках, что за что, чего, не было разговора.
But there was a reason Streltsov did not tell anybody of the injustice of his conviction. To have done so would have endangered himself and his family.
Начни Стрельцов утверждать, что его загнали в лагеря безвинно, тут же ему найдут еще какую-нибудь статью и отправят обратно. Это было совершенно очевидно, особенно Аркадию Ивановичу Вольскому. И Стрельцов молчал. И он молчал до самой смерти.
Streltsov died of cancer in 1990, aged just 53. Many believe his illness was caused by his time mining in the Gulag. For the first time, Igor Streltsov has revealed details of the only time his father ever spoke of the crime that took place some 32 years earlier.
Но в семье было это табу, то есть об этом не разговаривали. Когда вот отец уже умирал, он попросил меня выйти из палаты, где он лежал. Они остались наедине с матерью. И он так обнял мать. Он лежал уже, и все. Но он говорит: Рай, я ни в чем не виноват. Но я, говорит, перед тобой ни в чем не виноват. И там был не виноват.
In the 1960s, tensions between the Eastern Bloc and the West escalated as the Cold War reached new heights. The Berlin Wall became the physical symbol of the ideological fracture separating the nations of Europe. Helmut Klopfleisch was 13 when the wall was erected in 1961. He was a fan of Hertha Berlin Football Club. But the wall physically divided the team and its stadium from its supporters, now suddenly in communist East Berlin.
Und dann war ich natürlich todtraurig und bin dann immer noch in die Nähe vom Hertha-Platz gegangen, habe da an der Hinterlandmauer so, ich habe dann immer die Geräusche vom Hertha-Platz drüber gehört, wenn da ein Tor gefallen ist, dann haben wir auch gejubelt. Eigentlich war das ja lächerlich. Also heute könnte man darüber lachen, bloß damals war mir nicht zum Lachen. Also mir war todernst, weil sie uns ja mich hatten sie auch dann zwischendurch immer eingesperrt auch und verhört und alles Mögliche. Und da war, ich nehme an, das vorangetrieben war. Nicht wahrscheinlich, es war ja auch so, meine Akte lag ja bei ihm auf dem Schreibtisch. Damals hatten die mir auch bei den Verhören gesagt, dass der sich da so drüber geärgert hat, dass sie mich als Staatsfeind hingestellt haben damals.
Erich Mielke was not a man to be crossed. As head of the Stasi, the feared East German secret police, Mielke had gained a reputation for ruthlessness, with thousands of dissidents imprisoned and tortured. Together with his leader, Erich Honecker, he was responsible for the most totalitarian state in Europe's history. A staggering 5 million people, a third of the population, had a file kept on them by the Stasi. A further 1 in 6 was employed by the Stasi in some capacity, either as a full-time member or as an occasional spy to keep watch on other East Germans.
Und die für alles zuständig ist. Nicht? Also man pflegte da zu sagen, sie war die Braut auf jeder Hochzeit, die SED, und die Leiche bei jeder Beerdigung. Ja? Also wenn sie für alles zuständig sind, das halten sie ja gar nicht durch. Dann müssen sie also überall auch Aufpasser haben. Alle diese Umstände zwingen geradezu zu der Einrichtung einer Staatssicherheit nach innen, das heißt einer Aufpasserorganisation, einen Big Brother, wenn Sie so wollen, nicht?
As in the Soviet Union, East German football was manipulated to represent the state. The name Dynamo had become synonymous with the secret police, and Dynamo Berlin was no exception. In a terrible echo of Beria's brutal regime in Russia, Dynamo Berlin's club president was also the secret police chief, Erich Mielke.
Und der hat ja da auch überall gedreht, der hat ja die Schiedsrichter bestochen und beziehungsweise gedroht und dass die eben dann, wenn das eben 1-1 irgendwie stand, dann haben sie eben bis zur 98. Minute gespielt, damit die noch eine 2-1 machen. Oder gab es mal einen Elfmeter für die Dynamo, 10-mal hintereinander waren sie Meister mit Betrug und so weiter.
Dynamo Berlin formed the nucleus of what had become a very good East German national team. When the World Cup was held in West Germany in 1974, East was drawn to play West Germany in the group stages. The match soon came to be seen as a direct clash of political ideologies. Jürgen Kroy was the East German goalkeeper. He remembers the mood surrounding the match.
Das war ganz eindeutig darauf ausgelegt, dass man gesagt hat, die Weltmeisterschaft ist im Land des Klassenfeindes. Das ist also der Gegner und da muss man sich besondere Mühe geben. Und jetzt ein Einzelspiel oder ein Sportereignis dafür zu nutzen, um Systeme zu vergleichen, das ist eigentlich nur eine Elle, die die Propagandamaschinerie anlegt an einen solchen Vergleich.
It was too good an opportunity for propaganda for Mielke and Honecker to pass by. 1,500 Communist Party members and Stasi employees were specially selected to walk into West Germany as representatives of East German football fans.
Es war eine gespannte Stimmung im Stadion, aber ich sage positiv gespannte Stimmung. Es gab während der gesamten 90 Minuten weder auf dem Spielfeld noch von außen von den Zuschauern negative Dinge. Also ein verteiltes Spiel, ein sehr faires Spiel mit einem überraschenden Ausgang.
Rein, der Jürgen Kroy hat den Ball sicher gefangen und hat dann einen schnellen Konter eingeführt auf die rechte Seite. Ich bin aber trotzdem in diesem Raum gelaufen, dann kam der weite Pass. Es waren drei Spieler vor mir. nahm den Ball an und bin an ihm vorbei, dann an Sepp Maier. Habe ich ihn praktisch nur über ihn drüber weggehoben.
The single goal was enough to ensure the victory for East Germany. It was a massive propaganda boost for Honecker's regime.
And if there has been any political gain at all from this game of football, it's certainly gone east.
Also das war schon ein tolles Ding für die DDR. Also Sie sehen, nur weil es einen politischen Wert hatte, also so nach unserer Meinung, dass die DDR, also die Bundesrepublik, schlägt in der Fußballweltmeisterschaft.
But for some fans in the East, the result was the opposite of what they were looking for.
So, und ich habe dann später, 2 Jahre später, eine Familie kennengelernt. Der Vater hat in dieser Situation, wie das Torfeld, den Stuhl zum Beispiel genommen, hat in den Fernseher geschmissen vor Wut, weil er mit diesem Regime aber nicht einverstanden war und gewünscht hat, dass die DDR da verliert.
Although East Germany went out of the competition in the second round and West Germany went on to win the World Cup, the Communist East had scored a significant ideological victory. But it came at a price. Many Easterners grew cynical of the constant propaganda, and it opened their eyes to the way the regime was trying to manipulate the minds of its citizens.
Ja, indem sie das Tor einspielen und wenn sie bewegte Bilder bringen und denjenigen diese 15% in der DDR zeigen, das war das größte Ereignis in den letzten 2 Jahren. Eine bessere Propaganda können sie gar nicht haben. Ja, da kann ich nichts mehr dran machen, da können meine Kollegen nichts mehr dran machen, die damals auf dem Platz gestanden haben. Das ist dann eine Entwicklung auch eines Feindbildes innerhalb der Bevölkerung. Bei denen, die mit diesem System nicht einverstanden waren.
Jörg Berger was due to be the coach of the 1974 East German World Cup team. But he, like the vast majority of East Germans, was under the ever-watchful eye of the Stasi.
Trainer, wo ich viel ins westliche Ausland gefahren bin. Ich war Jugendauswahltrainer, ich war auf dem Sprung zum Nationaltrainer. Hat plötzlich die Stasi so Einfluss genommen auf mein Leben, dass ich mich beobachtet gefühlt habe, dass ich mich nicht mehr frei gefühlt habe, dass ich für die Stasi arbeiten sollte. Und ich habe das abgelehnt dort. Ich habe einen Bogen vorgelegt bekommen, wo die Erklärung war, für die Staatssicherheit zu arbeiten. Ich habe das abgelehnt und ich wusste, dass ich damit natürlich nur Nachteile habe. Im privaten Bereich, im beruflichen, auf beruflicher Ebene.
Identified as a possible defector, Berger's life was now potentially at risk. He was put under constant surveillance and was prevented from leaving the country. But after 2 years, Berger was allowed to travel to a football tournament in communist Yugoslavia.
Eine Flucht kann man schlecht planen, das war zu gefährlich. Aber ich habe gesagt, vielleicht habe ich nie wieder die Chance, bekomme ich nicht nochmal so eine Möglichkeit. Und ich habe mich dann entschieden, einen Tag vor dem Spiel in der Nacht aus dem Hotel mitten im Zug nach Belgrad war aber dann schon in Jugoslawien auf der Fahndungsliste. Also in Jugoslawien gab es auch schon eine Zeitung, wo mein Bild drin war. Und habe dann bei dieser Flucht sehr, sehr viel Glück gehabt. Das war ein entscheidender Moment in meinem Leben, dass ich dann an der Jugoslawien nach 12 Stunden Bahnfahrt allein im Abteil, da habe ich dann gewusst, was das Wort Angst bedeutet. Als dann ein Grenzer kam und meinen Pass genommen hat und aufgrund des Einblicks da auf diesen Pass mich befragt hat und dann merkte ich, er wusste, wer ich bin. Und dann habe ich gedacht, das war's. Und er kam dann zurück mit dem Pass, der auf den Namen Gerd Penzel lief und gab mir diesen Pass und sagte dann zu mir, und hiermit, Herr Berger, viel Glück im Westen.
Jörg Berger's narrow escape encouraged other dissidents to attempt to flee. Those who were successful came to the West with harrowing stories of life under communism. As a consequence, East Germany became ever more conscious of its international image. Eventually, when Glasnost arrived in the Soviet Union, the pressure on the former satellite countries started to mount.
There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In the winter of 1989, a series of demonstrations against the East German government swept away the regime of Erich Honecker. It was the first step in a process that would bring down the Berlin Wall. On November the 9th, 1989, families were reunited as thousands of East Berliners, granted their freedom, walked and ran to the west. Parts of the Berlin Wall are now maintained as symbols to remind today's Germans of their divided past. But these fragments no longer separate East German fans from their favorite teams.
Ja, hier an der Mauer standen wir damals und haben dann gelauscht, wenn drüben vom Stadion die Torschreie rüberkamen, haben wir uns gefreut, wenn Hertha ein Tor geschossen hat und waren todtraurig wiederum, dass wir nicht hinkamen. Und da hatten wir auch Angst, da hinten war ein Turm, da war ein Turm und wir standen hier und haben Angst gehabt, dass die uns wegfangen und hier an dieser blöden Mauer kamen wir eben, hier kamen wir nicht rüber. Ne? Bis da oben hoch war zu hoch, wir kamen da nicht rüber. Das war schon eine schlimme Zeit damals, ja.
Under communism, football became an instrument of propaganda and a tool of state control. But football defied the attempts to corrupt and manipulate it. For some, the cost of this resistance was high. Yet despite the ugliness of totalitarian rule, talented individuals and remarkable teams produced some of the most memorable moments in the history of the beautiful game.